This is the moment the world has been waiting for, and it arrived not with celebration, but with shock. If you look at the diplomatic channels between Washington and Tehran right now, you will see something unprecedented. Silence on one side, impossible conditions on the other, and in between, the kind of deadlock that turns regional conflicts into global crises. As of 9:37 a.m. Eastern Time, Thursday, March 12, 2026, Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Said Rahmani has broken his two-week silence since the devastating attacks on Tehran with a recorded message that has sent shockwaves through every intelligence agency, every oil trading desk, and every military command center from Washington to Beijing. Rahmani, already facing the collapse of Iran's electrical grid across 4 major cities, the destruction of 2 critical oil refineries, and mounting civilian casualties that United Nations observers now estimate at over 18,000 dead, has just been handed what sources inside the Iranian government are calling the final humiliation. His own military commanders, meeting in secret at an undisclosed location near the Caspian Sea, reportedly told him 3 days ago that Iran cannot sustain this war beyond another 6 weeks without risking total economic collapse. In this deep dive, we are going to examine exactly what those 3 demands are, why each one represents a red line that the United States cannot cross, how global oil markets reacted within minutes of this announcement, and what happens to your daily life when the world's most important energy choke point remains closed indefinitely because 2 governments refuse to blink. We are going to reveal the private conversations happening right now between American negotiators and regional allies who are terrified of being caught in the middle. And we are going to show you the timeline that matters, the next 72 hours that will determine whether this war de-escalates through diplomacy or explodes into something far more dangerous. Before we break down each demand word by word, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what happens in the next 3 days will reshape the global economy, your gas prices, and potentially the entire Middle Eastern power structure for the next decade. This story is moving faster than almost anything we have covered this year. You need to be here when the next development breaks. Let me show you exactly what Ayatollah Rahmani said in that 11-minute recorded video, why the State Department is calling it catastrophic, and what the words he chose reveal about how desperate Iran's position has actually become. Quick context first. Ayatollah Said Rahmani, 68 years old, assumed the role of Supreme Leader on February 23, 2026. Just 2 days after his predecessor died unexpectedly during what Iranian state media initially claimed was routine heart surgery. Intelligence sources in 3 different countries have since told major outlets that the surgery was actually emergency treatment following a suspected poisoning attempt, though Iran has never confirmed this publicly. Rahmani's ascension was controversial even within Iran's own power structure. He was not the Assembly of Experts' first choice. He was their compromise candidate after the 2 leading contenders deadlocked for 16 hours of voting. And now, less than 3 weeks into his leadership, he is managing a war that he did not start, facing military losses he did not anticipate, and answering to hardliners who blame him for every setback. The video appeared on Iranian state television at 7:14 a.m., local time in Tehran. Rahmani sat alone at a simple wooden desk. No flags behind him, no religious imagery, no advisors flanking him, just a man in traditional clerical robes speaking directly to camera for 11 minutes and 47 seconds. Intelligence analysts in Washington and Tel Aviv are still processing what that staging choice means, because in Persian political theater, everything is symbolism. A leader appearing alone without the traditional trappings of power often signals either supreme confidence or total isolation. Based on what he said, most analysts are betting on isolation. Rahmani opened with a statement that immediately set the tone. The Islamic Republic of Iran has shown restraint beyond what any nation should be asked to bear. He mentioned the attacks on civilian infrastructure that have left over 3 million people without reliable electricity. He mentioned the refinery strikes that have cut Iran's oil production by 42%, according to International Energy Agency estimates. He mentioned the naval blockade that has prevented Iranian oil tankers from reaching international waters for 9 consecutive days. And then he said something that every person watching understood was directed at one audience, the American president. The United States believes it can bomb Iran into submission. They are wrong. Then he laid out the 3 demands, not requests, not negotiating positions, demands, and the language he used was absolute. These conditions are not subject to modification, he said. These are the minimum requirements for any discussion of peace. Demand number 1, the United States must publicly acknowledge in a joint statement co-signed by the president and presented to the United Nations Security Council, that Iran has the sovereign right to develop and maintain a complete nuclear fuel cycle for peaceful purposes, including uranium enrichment to 20% without international interference or inspection beyond standard IAEA protocols. Let's pause right there and understand what he just asked for. This is not a demand for nuclear weapons capability, at least not explicitly. But 20% enriched uranium is weapons-grade material. You cannot build a bomb with 20%, but you are 90% of the way there. The remaining jump to 90% weapons-grade takes weeks, not years, if you have the infrastructure already in place. Rahmani knows this, American negotiators know this, and he knows they know. So why phrase it this way? Because he is giving himself the technical ability to build a nuclear weapon while maintaining plausible deniability that this was ever about weapons at all. The State Department's initial response, delivered through an unnamed senior official speaking to 3 major news networks within 40 minutes of the video airing, was blunt. This demand is a non-starter. It violates the fundamental principles of the 2015 nuclear agreement framework. It violates every commitment Iran has made to the international community. It is not happening. But here is what that official did not say. They did not say they were walking away from negotiations. They did not say this was the end of diplomatic talks. They said it was a non-starter, which in diplomatic language means we are saying no publicly while we figure out if there is any version of this we could say yes to privately. And that gap between the public no and the private maybe is where every dangerous compromise in history begins. Demand number 2, and this is where it gets even more complicated. The United States must remove all military assets from the Persian Gulf region, including naval vessels, air bases, and ground troops stationed in Iraq, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates within 90 days of any ceasefire agreement. Furthermore, the United States must agree to a 20-year moratorium on reestablishing any permanent military presence within 500 nautical miles of Iranian territorial waters. Think about what he just demanded. He wants the United States to abandon every military base and alliance that has defined American Middle East policy for the last 40 years. He wants the Fifth Fleet pulled out of Bahrain. He wants American troops out of Kuwait. He wants air bases in Qatar shut down. And he wants a guarantee, binding for 2 decades, that America will never come back. This is not a security demand. This is a geopolitical reordering of the entire region. If the United States agrees to this, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel are suddenly facing Iran with no American military backstop. Regional allies who have built their entire defense strategies around American protection would be on their own overnight. And Rahmani knows that this puts the United States in an impossible position. Say yes and abandon your allies. Say no and take responsibility for prolonging the war. The Pentagon's response came faster than the State Department's. Defense Secretary Martinez, speaking from a secure facility whose location was not disclosed, called the demand militarily and strategically untenable. But what really caught analysts' attention was what came next in Rahmani's video. He said, and these are his exact words, "We understand this demand may cause concern among Iran's neighbors. We are prepared to offer security guarantees to all Gulf nations that commit to remaining neutral and closing American bases on their territory." Translation: Iran is offering to cut deals directly with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other Gulf states. Drop your American alliances, stay neutral, and we will not threaten you. It is a divide-and-conquer strategy aimed at fracturing the coalition that has contained Iranian influence for decades. Demand number 3 is the one that has oil traders panicking and economists revising their forecasts. The United States and its allies must pay reparations totaling $340 billion for damages to Iranian infrastructure, civilian casualties, and economic losses sustained during this conflict. Payment structure to be negotiated, but must include immediate release of $70 billion in frozen Iranian assets currently held in foreign banks, plus $270 billion in direct compensation to be paid over 10 years. $340 billion. To put that number in perspective, that is more than the entire GDP of countries like Finland or Chile. It is roughly equivalent to what the United States spent in total military aid to all countries globally over the last 5 years. And Rahmani is demanding it as a precondition for even beginning ceasefire talks. The White House response was immediate and unequivocal. Press Secretary Williams, reading from a prepared statement during an emergency briefing, said the United States does not pay ransoms, does not reward aggression, and will not provide financial compensation to a regime that has killed American service members and threatened international peace. The demand is rejected in its entirety. But while the official responses were flying back and forth in public, something else was happening behind the scenes. And this is where the story gets really interesting, because what governments say in press conferences and what they say in private are two completely different things. According to sources familiar with the conversations, and these sources spoke to multiple outlets including Reuters and the Financial Times on condition of anonymity because they are not authorized to discuss classified diplomatic exchanges. American negotiator Robert Kellerman held a secure video call with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Tavakoli approximately 6 hours before Rahmani's video aired publicly. The call lasted 93 minutes, and according to reconstructed accounts from 3 different sources who were briefed on the discussion, Kellerman asked one question that has now taken on enormous significance. If we found a formula on enrichment that gave you fuel cycle rights under modified inspection, if we agreed to a phased military drawdown that protected our allies, and if we unlocked the frozen assets without calling it reparations, would you have the authority to sell that to the supreme leader? Tavakoli's response, according to these same sources, was chilling. I would have had that authority 3 days ago. I do not have it today. The hardliners are in control now. What you are hearing in that video is not negotiation. It is ultimatum. That conversation reveals something critical. These demands were not Rahmani's opening negotiating position. They were forced on him by military commanders and Revolutionary Guard leaders who believe Iran is losing and needs to secure maximum concessions before the situation deteriorates further. Rahmani is not negotiating from strength. He is reading a script written by the people who now hold the real power in Tehran. Let's examine what happened in the 12 hours after that video aired, because the cascade of reactions tells you everything about how the world is processing these demands. Oil markets reacted first. Brent crude, which had stabilized around $93 per barrel following the International Energy Agency's announcement of a coordinated strategic reserve release, jumped to $118 within 2 hours of trading. West Texas Intermediate climbed to $104. Energy analysts immediately raised their projections for gasoline prices. If this standoff continues for another 2 weeks, American consumers are looking at a national average above $5 per gallon. In California and Hawaii, projections are pushing towards $6.50. But the oil spike was just the beginning. While markets were processing the energy implications, 3 Gulf states were making calculations of their own. Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman held an emergency meeting with his top security advisors at 2 a.m. local time. The United Arab Emirates recalled its ambassador to Washington for consultations. And Qatar's foreign ministry released a carefully worded statement saying it hoped all parties would pursue diplomatic solutions that respect the sovereignty and security interests of all nations in the region. That Qatari statement is important because of what it did not say. It did not condemn Iran's demands. It did not reaffirm support for the American position. It called for respect of sovereignty, which is diplomatic code for we are keeping our options open. And when America's closest Gulf allies start hedging, that tells you they are genuinely worried about being left exposed if Washington cuts a deal that leaves them vulnerable. At the same time this was happening, Iran was demonstrating that these were not empty demands backed by a defeated military. Iranian Revolutionary Guard naval units launched coordinated strikes on 3 commercial vessels attempting to transit through alternate shipping routes around the Strait of Hormuz closure. A Greek-flagged oil tanker was hit by a missile approximately 140 nautical miles south of the strait. A Liberian-registered container ship reported damage from what investigators now believe was a naval mine. And a Singaporean LNG carrier was forced to reverse course after Iranian fast attack boats surrounded it and warned the captain that passage through the area was prohibited. These were not warning shots. These were enforcement actions proving that Iran can sustain its blockade even while negotiating. The message to Washington was clear: your economic pressure has limits. Our blockade does not. Here is where we need to talk about what is not being said publicly, but is absolutely dominating private conversations in Washington, European capitals, and Gulf state palaces. Every professional who analyzes this region, whether they work for the State Department, the Pentagon, oil companies, or independent think tanks, is asking the same question: how much pain is the United States willing to accept to avoid giving Iran these concessions? Because here is the brutal calculation. If oil stays above $100 per barrel for the next 3 months, which is the minimum timeline if this war continues, you are looking at economic damage that shows up in inflation numbers, consumer spending, political approval ratings, and potentially the outcome of elections. The administration sitting in the White House right now has to weigh whether holding firm on these demands is worth the domestic political cost of sustained high energy prices. Meanwhile, Iran is doing its own calculation. Can they hold out long enough for American domestic politics to force a compromise? Iranian economists speaking anonymously to international media estimate that Iran can sustain current conditions for approximately 8 more weeks before critical shortages of food, medicine, and fuel create internal unrest that threatens regime stability. 8 weeks versus 3 months. That is the clock both sides are watching. Now, let's talk about who is saying what behind closed doors, because the public statements are theater. The real negotiation is happening in conversations that neither government wants you to know about. Former CIA director and current advisor to multiple administrations, Michael Brennan, speaking to Bloomberg this afternoon, said something that should make everyone nervous. The 3 demands, as stated, are impossible for the United States to accept. But impossible demands are often a smokescreen for the real negotiation happening in backchannels. The question is whether those backchannels are actually producing movement or whether both sides have genuinely painted themselves into corners they cannot escape. Kareem Sajidpour from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace put it differently in an interview with CNN. Iran is not asking for a settlement. They are asking for a surrender, and the United States cannot give them a surrender without destroying every alliance, every security guarantee, and every commitment it has made to partners in the region. This is not a gap that gets bridged with creative diplomacy. This is a chasm. But then there are the people who study Iran from the inside, the Farsi speakers, the former intelligence officials, the academics who have spent decades trying to understand how decisions really get made in Tehran. Suzanne Maloney from Brookings made an observation that cuts through all the analysis. Focus less on what Rahmani demanded and more on who wrote those demands for him. If he was in control, he would have left himself negotiating room. The fact that these conditions are absolute tells you he is not in control. And that is far more dangerous than any specific demand he made. When the leader who is supposed to be negotiating does not actually have the power to negotiate, you are not talking to the decision maker anymore. You are talking to a spokesman reading someone else's script. And the people who wrote that script, the Revolutionary Guard commanders, the hardline clerics, the military leaders who control actual weapon systems are not sitting in video calls with American diplomats. They are calculating whether they can inflict enough pain to force concessions before their own economy collapses. Let's examine what the United States can actually do in response, because the options are more limited than most people realize. Option 1. Accept the demands. This is politically impossible, strategically catastrophic, and would represent a complete abandonment of every ally in the region. It is not happening. Option 2. Reject the demands and intensify military pressure. This means more strikes, deeper escalation, and acceptance that oil prices will remain elevated for months. It also means accepting American casualties, because Iran has already demonstrated it will hit back at military targets. Option 3. Find the face-saving compromise. Offer modified enrichment rights under strict inspection. Agree to reduce military presence gradually without full withdrawal. Release frozen assets as humanitarian aid rather than reparations. Package it all as mutual de-escalation rather than meeting demands. This is the only path that ends this diplomatically. But both sides would have to want it. And right now, neither government can admit publicly that they want it. The timeline for what happens next is brutally compressed. Here is what we are watching in the next 72 hours. Tonight, March 11th, the United Nations Security Council holds an emergency session requested by France. The vote on a resolution calling for immediate ceasefire and return to 2015 nuclear agreement framework will fail because Russia and China will veto. But watch the statements from non-permanent members. If countries like South Africa, Brazil, or Indonesia start calling for compromise rather than demanding Iran back down, that signals growing international pressure on the United States to negotiate. Tomorrow, March 12th, the International Energy Agency releases its monthly oil market report with updated forecasts. If they project sustained supply disruptions, that will trigger another wave of futures buying and push prices even higher. Energy Secretary Chen is expected to announce whether the United States will authorize additional strategic reserve releases. If they do, it is a signal they are preparing for a long standoff. If they do not, it means they think a resolution is closer than markets believe. Thursday, March 13th, Iranian parliament holds a scheduled session where hardline members are expected to demand that Rahmani set a deadline for American response. If parliament tries to box him in with time limits, that removes whatever flexibility he might have had. Watch whether moderate members push back or whether they stay silent. Also on Thursday, Secretary of State Rodriguez meets with Saudi and UAE foreign ministers in Riyadh. This meeting was scheduled 2 weeks ago, but it has taken on massive new significance. If America's Gulf allies leave that meeting with public statements of unwavering support, it strengthens the U.S. position. If they leave with vague calls for dialogue and de-escalation, it tells you they are genuinely considering Iran's security guarantee offer. And here is the most critical thing to watch. Robert Kellerman, the American negotiator, has not spoken publicly since Rahmani's video aired. His silence is deliberate. If he is actually negotiating through back channels, he cannot be seen publicly undermining the administration's firm rejection of Iran's demands. The longer he stays quiet, the more likely it is that real conversations are happening behind the scenes. So where does this leave us? Today, March 11th, 2026, Ayatollah Said Rahmani, a supreme leader who has held power for barely 3 weeks, issued 3 demands that the United States has publicly rejected as impossible. Iran's economy is approaching collapse within 8 weeks. American consumers are facing sustained high gas prices. Gulf allies are quietly exploring whether they need contingency plans that do not rely on American protection. Oil is trading above $100. The Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed, and the people who actually have power in Tehran, the military commanders and hardliners who wrote those demands, have shown no sign of backing down. Subscribe, turn on notifications. When Kellerman breaks his silence, or when either government makes the next move, we will break it down exactly the way we broke this down today. Evidence first, what the incentives are. Second, what it means for your life always. This is not ending quickly. This is not ending cleanly. And what happens in the next 72 hours determines whether we are watching the beginning of a negotiated settlement or the escalation into something far worse.